Hello everyone, and welcome to today's guide, where we'll take a look at objects and assets in GameMaker. Just like before, you can take a look at the playback bar or the video description for individual segments and timestamps. And if you don't already have a project of your own to follow along, you can try one of the many templates offered by GameMaker in the startup window. In this video, we'll be using the platformer template. Level 3: Objects and Assets. Objects are arguably the most fundamental elements of a game. They contain most, sometimes even all, of the important features that define the overall experience. They are your player character, your clickable buttons, your breakable blocks. They let you show sprites, play sounds, respond to player input, and so on. So it should come as no surprise that there are many different tools to manipulate them, properties that can be changed, and so on. Thankfully for us, GameMaker has a very user-friendly way of organizing and presenting all this information, which is what we're going to see. For the sake of clarity, let's establish the difference between a game object and an instance. When we refer to a game object, we are talking about a collection of events and properties that can be copied over and manipulated in your game, like a blueprint for gameplay elements. Instances, then, are set copies of a game object. They share all of the properties and code you have defined in the object itself, but they can be independently changed and manipulated without affecting the underlying blueprint. Another element we'll look at that shares many similarities with objects is assets. They work like a stripped down and simplified version of objects, where they display a sprite, text, or sequence, but are not bound by game events or code. These will be your decorative props, your tutorial texts, and your fixed UI elements. Unlike in the previous videos, interacting with objects and assets comes through many different windows and actions. Some of it is through the Assets tab on the right, or the Inspector tab on the left, or double-clicking in the Room Editor, or even through the Workspace. But don't sweat it, we'll cover each case on a per-need basis. Element placement and manipulation. Let's start populating our scene by placing down instances of objects. Like mentioned before, instances are like individual copies of objects, which themselves are like blueprints. Every time you place an object in your scene, you're actually placing a new independent instance of it. To place down an instance of an object, first go to an instance layer, then select your object in the asset browser. Then hold Alt and click on your scene. Alternatively, click and drag the object from the asset browser into your scene. Holding Alt, then clicking and dragging will place multiple instances of that object alongside your grid. This exact process applies to placing assets like sprites, sequences, and text, but on an asset layer instead. To select an existing element, go to its corresponding layer, then click on it in your scene. You can also refer back to the room navigation portion of our room editor video for more object and asset selection techniques. Once selected, you can move them around by clicking and dragging, or by using the arrow keys. Holding Ctrl while moving your selected element will temporarily disable grid snapping and allow you to move it freely. Holding Ctrl, then using the arrow keys will move your selected element one pixel at a time in the given direction. To delete an instance or asset, select it, then press Delete. You can also transform instances and assets by changing their scale and rotation. Pressing the mirror button or the X key on your keyboard will mirror it horizontally, and pressing the flip button or the Y key will mirror it vertically. Hover your mouse over the edge of the selection until this arrow cursor shows up. Clicking and dragging it will resize your element in that axis. Doing the same thing over in the corners of your selection will resize the element in both axes at once. If you do that and also hold Shift, the element will be scaled uniformly. Holding Ctrl will make the scaling ignore grid snapping, which you can combine with the Shift keybind. Lastly, to rotate an instance or asset, hover slightly away from a given corner of your selection until this circular cursor shows up. Click and drag to rotate it around its origin point, and hold Shift to make the rotation snap to increments of 15 degrees. Double-clicking on either an object instance or an asset brings up its properties window, which we'll look into next. But merely selecting them also brings up their properties in the inspector window, located by default on the bottom left of the interface. Instance Properties. The Instance Properties window is where you can configure the appearance and behavior of each object instance. Through it, you can precisely define some of the things we've seen before, such as positioning and scaling, but also handle object-specific events, such as variables and creation code. Double-clicking an instance will bring up its properties window, but merely selecting it will also make those available in the Inspector tab on the left side of the screen on the default layout. Let's go over each option from top to bottom. The topmost option is the instance name. It is how your object instance is uniquely identified in your code. You can use it in scripts and in the code of other objects to apply changes or call functions for that particular instance, or you can change it to better organize your project. Keep in mind, however, that an instance's name must be unique across the entire game, including between different rooms. Next is the Lock Instance button. If enabled, it prevents changes from being made, deliberately or accidentally, to your instance. This includes, but is not limited to, preventing you from moving or deleting that instance. This is especially useful for important objects, such as the player character or controller entities. Click the padlock icon again to unlock it. Here we have the Object Selection tool. It lets you change which object that instance refers to, while maintaining all of its properties. This can come in handy if you have multiple similar objects that can be easily swapped during design. The button to the left of it, Inherit, applies the properties of that instance in a parent room to the same instance in a child room. More about room inheritance in our Room Editor video. Edit Object opens up a window that lets you edit the object itself, such as its events, sprite, physics, and so on. Important to note, this is not the same as editing just an instance of an object. Any changes made here will apply to every instance of that object across your game. Pressing Variables will bring up your object's variable definitions. These are preset variables you can define in the object itself, but which you can modify for each instance. If you have any defined, they'll show up on this list. Clicking this Edit button lets you override the default value. Clicking it again will reset that specific variable back to its default value. Creation Code brings up a code editor window, where you can add bespoke pieces of code to that specific instance. This code runs once after the object's create event, and is a handy way to add more complex and personalized behavior, such as manipulating variables, referencing other objects, or even overriding object functions. We also have an Inherit button to the side of the Creation Code button, for when you have a parent room. Clicking on it will inherit the creation code of the version of this instance from the parent room into the child room's instance, overriding whatever you have previously defined. Finally, we have some presentation properties. Color opens up a color picker that lets you change the color of your instance by multiplying the selected color with your object sprite. Rotation sets the angle of your instance in degrees by rotating it around the object's sprite origin. Flip X and Flip Y will mirror your instance horizontally and vertically, respectively, by changing the sign of that axis scale. Scale X and Scale Y define the size of your instance in each axis, and are a multiple of your object's initial dimensions. They can be made negative to mirror the instance in that axis, as we've seen earlier. X and Y specify the initial position of that instance in the room. Frame makes the object instance use that particular frame number from its sprite, and if the sprite has animations, will also make it start playing from there. Lastly, Image Speed sets the speed at which said sprite animation plays, if you have any. It is a multiplier, so values lesser than 1 make the animation slower, and greater values make it faster. You can see this in action by pressing the Play Animation button on the top toolbar of the Room Editor. Asset Properties. The properties and settings pertaining to assets are very closely related to what we've seen for instances. The key difference, as mentioned earlier, is that assets do not have an underlying object that defines their behavior. And while assets can be manipulated with scripts and objects, they're usually reserved for otherwise unchanging elements, such as static decorations. Double-clicking a sprite asset brings up a subset of properties we've already seen in the Instance Properties chapter, so refer to just a couple minutes back into this video. With font elements, double-click on the text you placed. A window will show up with various properties. You can also see it on the Inspector tab on the left side of the Room Editor on the default layout. A quick rundown of them. At the top, we have the asset's unique name, similar to how objects are handled, and next to it a padlock button that locks the element from being changed or deleted. Underneath it is a selector for which font the text uses, in case you want to change it. Next, we have a text field where you can write your own text, with support for line breaks. Later, we have some presentation properties such as color, rotation, scale, and positioning. Again, similar to how it's handled with instances. Origin X and Origin Y define an offset from the text's top left corner, around which rotation and scaling happens. Frame W and Frame H define the text box width and height respectively, and only applies if the wrap checkbox is enabled. This, in turn, forces the text to break into lines if it reaches the edge of the box. Next, we have horizontal and vertical text alignment options, which determine how the text is rendered when multiple lines are present or when the wrap property is enabled. And finally, we have character spacing for additional spacing between individual characters of the text, and line spacing for the spacing between each line. Both of these can be made negative. Lastly, with sequence elements, we have a small number of properties when double-clicking them. As usual, we have an asset name field, a lock button, and a sequence selector at the top. Then, a color picker, which multiplies the color of everything in the sequence with the one you picked. X and Y for precise positioning within your room. Head specifies at which frame your sequence starts. In other words, where its playhead is positioned in the sequence. And finally, animation speed is a multiplier for how fast this sequence's animation plays. Values greater than 1 make it faster, while values smaller than 1 make it slower. All asset types and object instances, when selected, show the set of alignment buttons on the Inspector tab. You can use these to precisely position the elements in relation to the room. If you have multiple elements selected, you can use the Distribute Vertically and Distribute Horizontally buttons to position them with equal distances between each individual element's origin point. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something new. If you liked this video, consider leaving a like. And if you want to learn more about the Room Editor, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future video tutorials like this. Do you have any questions or tips of your own? Make sure to leave them down in the comments below. Happy game making!